Hello, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde and bonjour. Welcome to the Pearson Center podcast. I'm Kevin Bosch. I'm the chair of the Pearson Center. Today, we're very fortunate to have a discussion with Jeff Copenace, who is a longtime friend of mine and also a board member of the Pearson Center, and also the chief of the Onigaming Ojibway First Nation in Ontario. And he's going to have a chat today with Pam Damoff about many of the challenges and problems that are facing not just his nation, but First Nations across Canada. And hopefully have a discussion on some of the solutions that all of us should be working towards to ensure that all Canadians prosper and move forward. I would like to acknowledge that both Jeff and I are coming to you today from the territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, with whom we continue our journey of reconciliation. I would like to acknowledge the sustaining sponsors for the Pearson Center, who support us all year long. I'll like highlight AMAPCO, CBTU, NWMO, TikTok, Bruce Power, Sandstone Group, Baskin, and National News Watch is our media sponsor. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to our wonderful President and CEO, Pam Damoff. Pam.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And thanks for always opening us in such a good way. And Jeff, it's just wonderful to have you join us today. You and I have gotten to know each other through your participation on the Pearson Center board. And during those conversations, I've learned a little bit about you. You know, you've had a pretty illustrious career working on Parliament Hill and Queen's Park, as well as for Indigenous political organizations. And you had mentioned, you know, it would be great to be able to tell the story of, myself, but also my community, to educate Canadians, which is such an important aspect of reconciliation, is education and learning. So maybe to start with, Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing, Pam. And miigwech, Kevin, for the kind introduction. Buju, Mishkweb, Indigenous, Makwan, and Dodam. Buju in our language is a greeting, hello. Mishkweb is my traditional name. It means one who stands or one who walks. Makwa is it means bear. That's my clan. So I just introduced my name and my traditional clan to you. That's how our people, the Anishinaabe people in Treaty 3, recognize ourselves and recognize our clan and our family systems. And my name was given to me by my grandmother when I was about 4 or 5 years old in a ceremony. I still remember we're up at dawn, 5 in the morning, and the candle lights. And I just remember this beautiful, beautiful, kind smile on my grandma's face. She was passing down these traditions and passing down these traditional names. And for us, when our time is done here on Mother Earth, when we go back to the spirit world or back to Kijimanitu, the creator, they recognize us by our traditional names. And that's why our traditional names are so important to us. I've been in politics for a long time now. I was originally introduced to politics as a legislative page in 1992 under the Bob Rae government. I was about 13 years old, and I didn't enjoy it, actually. I didn't. I thought it was kind of funny. It was my first exposure to politics. I didn't enjoy watching adults yell at each other. I found it bizarre. And so there's actually a newspaper article back home from when I was in grade 8. I did an interview after my experience, and the headline says, "No political future for Copenace." Because I didn't like it that much. Yeah.
Well, I'm with you on the arguing back and forth. I'm just curious, how does a 13-year-old in grade 8 end up at Queen's Park? Like, how did that opportunity even present itself to you?
Yeah, I was really lucky. I had parents that really cared about education, And they told me that they moved me away from the reserve when I was about 1 or 2 years old, to go to school in Kenora because the school system was better and they wanted me to have an education. And even though my parents weren't really keen on politics, my principal in elementary school recognized me, my intelligence, and my academics, and they applied on my behalf. And after I got accepted, and I was one of the first First Nation, I think I was the second or third First Nation legislative page selected. Um, they had to convince my parents to send me, and so they did, and I got sent down for 2 months. And it was a good experience for me. It was the first time seeing a city really, and living in a city, and that was really eye opening for from a kid from the bush. But it was also a chance to see how politics worked. I did a debating class, my first debating class, so I learned how to debate in grade 8. But yeah, it's really again thanks to my teachers and educators that recognized me. I also want to give some credit to my mom and my dad, but especially my mom. When we were children, and I don't think my mom would have seen this as being political. Whenever something was on TV, like the Oka crisis or the Meech Lake Accord in particular, she would make me, my brother, and my sister watch TV. And she'd say, watch the news. And she said, this is about you. This is about your people. And you're going to watch and you're going to learn. And she went so far as in, I think it was 1990 or 1991, after Meech Lake had finished, Elijah Harper was going to be in Gimli, Manitoba. And so she drove us 4 hours to Gimli to meet him at a festival. And I was just a little kid, but I remember like a big crowd around him. And I got to walk up to him and shake his hand. And Elijah would become a friend later on in life. I would have never expected it, but I got to meet the man who stopped the Meech Lake Accord fighting for Aboriginal Indigenous rights. And that was a big, inspiring moment for me. Fast forward, I went to Carleton University, and that's where I got introduced to the Liberal Party of Canada through the Carleton Young Liberals. And in all honesty, the president at the time was a roommate of mine, and he told me that if I came to their meetings, that there'd be free beer. And I went. And but lo and behold, again, I love politics. Um, it blew my mind how accessible members of parliament were. And so I started going to these Liberal Party of Canada events, and to me, it was like seeing Canadian Hollywood in front of me. And so I got to see Sheila Copps in person. I got to see Alan Rock. Uh, I'm trying to think of all of the people that were there. Jean Chrétien, of course, John Manley, Paul Martin. And so all of these individuals who I'd only seen on TV, I got to meet in person through the Liberal Party of Canada. And not just that, there'd be opportunities for Q&As. So I'd be able to get the microphone and ask them questions about, again, back then the terminology was Aboriginal peoples, but ask questions about First Nations peoples, the First Nation issues. And I was hooked. And the rest is kind of history. In 2000, I got elected to the Young Liberals of Canada, the position for the Aboriginal Peoples Commission, the Aboriginal Youth Representative. And I gave this really eloquent speech at the 2000 convention. And people were pretty amazed by it. And that night, they sat me with Jean Chrétien and Elijah Harper. And that's really when my true political experience started to begin.
That is really cool. I mean, did Elijah remember meeting you before?
No, he didn't. He must have met so many people.
Yeah.
We became friends though, and he really took me under his wing. I tell this story. Elijah actually flew me up north after meeting me to the riding of Churchill up to his home, Red Sucker Lake, Cree Nation. And when we got there, I was there. I was supposed to help him with his nomination, help him with his campaign. And when we got there, I said, "Oh, good. What do we do?" And he asked, "You've never done this before?" And I said, "Nope." But I started to learn. And he won the nomination. We were successful in that. He lost the election, sadly, but I got to work on a campaign, and that was the first campaign that I ever got to work on was Elijah Harper. So again, that was a huge experience for me. After that, I got to have dinner with Jean Chrétien 3 times as my role as Aboriginal youth. And I didn't get to speak with him a lot, but I got to know Aileen Chrétien, his wife, very well. And again, for a young First Nation person, most of our people don't get these experiences. So I feel blessed. I feel lucky, but that's what really got me hooked into the Liberal Party of Canada. And I've been a registered member ever since 2000. And so that's been a big part of my politics. It's funny. I I at the time there were very few First Nation people working in politics. I think I could count maybe two or three of us. I remember Leanne Cameron and Fiona Blunden. But other than that, again, it was really hard to meet other Indigenous people. And now, if you go up to Parliament Hill, they've got Indigenous caucus. They've got Indigenous staff meetings. We didn't have any of that. It was really new at the time. So I'm pretty proud to be at the forefront of all of that work.
It speaks a lot, though, to mentorship, eh? The fact that Elijah Harper was there, so you could actually see yourself in politics, but also the fact that he took you under his wing, and working on your first campaign is really exciting. And but had you not had that mentorship, you might not have had as positive an experience that you did, right? I mean, having those role models is really important.
Definitely, and I try to give back as well. Another individual who became a part of my life around this time is former National Chief Phil Fontaine, and he became a friend. Also, I actually met him. So in 2001, I graduated university, and I was invited to meet and work for the Paul Martin team at finance. And so I went straight from university to work for the finance minister. And one of the things that he told me is that he had a real interest in Aboriginal issues, and he was hoping that I could help. And so one of the first things that Mr. Martin did was ask me to start introducing them to Indigenous leaders. And one of those first leaders was Phil Fontaine. And I remember actually Phil showed up like 2 hours late for the first meeting. And I remember Mr. Martin really pacing and like, "Where's Phil? Where's Phil?" And he got there, thankfully, and they had an incredible meeting. They just hit it off. I'm really proud of that. They're still close friends to this day. And of course, through that relationship, we worked on the Kelowna Accord together. But really, at the base of it, again, were these friendships, was this mentorship that you mentioned. I remember being in my young 20s and being in Montreal, and I was caught in the rain. And out of nowhere, in a horse and buggy in old Montreal, is Phil Fontaine. And he says, "Get in my horse and buggy." So I did. And we rode around for 2 hours just talking politics and just talking about life. And again, I'd go to Winnipeg. He used to own a junior hockey team. And so I'd go to Winnipeg and he'd call me up and say, "Won't you come watch some hockey with me?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm with my brother and my dad." And he'd say, "Bring them too." And so I was really lucky. I'd go to a game. Phil Fontaine and my dad would speak Anishinaabe in our language. And I don't speak the language, so I'd have no idea what they're talking about. But it was just awesome, again, to have these friendships at a young age with these incredible politicians. And, they've got no reason. You don't have to do that. But it just shows what good-hearted people these men really were, and how they were trying to give back, and they obviously had a big impact and shaped my life. And of course, we would go on to do really important work together in public policy, including the Kelowna Accord, 18 months of negotiations with First Nations, the Métis Nation, Inuit all across the country. And that was, again, largely Phil Fontaine and Paul Martin.
Martin spent his whole life, even after politics, advocating on issues of importance to Indigenous peoples. It wasn't just while he was in government. I know it was something that he continued to work on even after politics. He probably because he met people like you, Jeff, to be honest with you, who educated him about some of the changes that were needed. You must have seen a big change. I know you worked on some of the legislation during the time I was in office as well. The First Nations Child and Family Services legislation, as well as C-12, to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Well, thank you for that. Those are proud moments as well. C-92, I was working for Minister Jane Philpott at the time. And, I actually, going back a little bit further, I was on phone calls in 2014 and 15 with, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, former Member of Parliament Carolyn Bennett, former Member of Parliament Jody Wilson-Raybould. So I was on those calls, including with my old boss, Paul Martin, and we were working on the Liberal Party of Canada platform for Aboriginal peoples, Indigenous peoples, and heading into the 2015 election. And one of the things that I was really, really pushing for was that you should have a First Nation children's agenda. Someone else at the time who was also really pushing for it was Bob Rae, former Liberal leader. And, Bob was the one I remember telling my old boss, Jane Philpott, why don't you just work with First Nation child advocate Cindy Blackstock and strike a deal on First Nation child and family services? And, that's really the impetus of it. Jane Philpott, in her own words, viewed it as a humanitarian crisis. I think she said those words on Parliament Hill. And if you look at the numbers of First Nation children in foster care, family services in Canada, it's enormous. It's huge. They make up more than 50% of the number of children in care today. So for the Canadian government, it was a really important step, and it might have been the most important work that Justin Trudeau did. And again, it's just really giving First Nations jurisdiction over their own children. There was something in this country called birth alerts, where if a First Nation woman had a child, and she was under the poverty line, as an example, her child would be apprehended at birth. She would have no rights at all. And this was happening. And so we've ended those birth alerts for the large part across the country. And again, that was Justin Trudeau and Jane Philpott who did that. And again, working with National Chief Perry Bellegarde and child advocate Cindy Blackstock. And again, Bob Rae had a big influence on that. So those are moments that are really proud. There's First Nations across the country, including ours, that are just at the forefront of starting negotiations on self-government for taking back control of our own children. And so it's going to be a long process, but that's something I'm really proud of. And of course, the work at Justice Canada on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to me, that's just recognizing Indigenous peoples' historic place in this country, and recognizing us, of course, as historic and current governments. To me, it really is about giving the ability for communities to make decisions in their own territories, and not their own decisions, but really joint decision making with Canada and whatever the provincial jurisdiction is. And again, I know that it's a real sticking point for development. I know that there's a real strong debate in this country, but it's something necessary for Indigenous people if we're going to survive long into the future. And so again, that's work that under Justice Minister David Lametti that I'm really proud of. I thought David was a huge advocate for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. I was really proud to get to know him and work with him, and obviously really excited for him in his current role in government as well.
You know, on the kids in foster care, Jeff, we think, okay, well, kids are not being taken away from their families anymore. Residential schools, that was a long time ago, even though it wasn't. 60 scoop, well, that's ended. But the number of kids who have been removed from their families and from their communities and their culture and put into the foster care system, it's criminal in my mind.
Thank you.
And it also is a pipeline into the criminal justice system for a lot of these kids. And, you know, when I talk to my community in Oakville about the number of Indigenous people in prison right now, it's Indigenous women are the fastest growing prison population. Out west, it's probably 70-80% of our prisons are Indigenous women. And the same with Indigenous men. It's disproportionate to the Indigenous population. And when you're basically setting kids up in a cycle of, removing them from their families, trauma, it's just a never-ending cycle, starting back with residential schools and colonization, but it still exists today. I went to Grand Valley Prison and met a woman from Flin Flon who had 2 kids and had been completely separated from them, and they'd both been put in foster care, even though the stats show that if she had been able to be part of their life, the stats show those kids have got something, like the percentage of those kids that end up in the criminal justice system is crazy. But removing that mom from her community, from her children, largely for crimes of poverty, addiction, and especially for Indigenous women, I don't know that Canadians understand the challenges that Indigenous people face in this country.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I think you're dead on when you talk about the impact of residential schools, day schools. You know, the reality is that even the apprehension of First Nation children is all Canadian policy. It was all intended to create the situation that we're in. You know, people complain constantly. I hear it in Kenora, Ontario, about the problems in the inner city. It's happening, you know, it used to be just downtown Vancouver East Side, but it seems like every city in the country has got a Vancouver downtown East Side now. And most of them are Indigenous. A lot of them are. A lot of them are First Nation. And that's just the reality. And again, that's what these policies for, you know, residential school was all about, taking children away from their families. Day schools was all about taking children away from their families. You know, people would argue it was about assimilation, but the assimilation part didn't happen. And what happened was you've stripped generations of First Nations people from their ability to have life skills, for their ability to have parenting skills, you know, their ability to get a proper education because their education was so skewed by abuse. And I've got plenty of stories from my own family in that regard. And so the reality is that you've got these lost generations, and you've got young people that don't know how to care for themselves, and you've got rampant addiction issues and broken families. And it's going to take a long time to fix that. It's going to take a long time to fix, I think, the homelessness issues that we're facing in our cities. But it's a very Canadian problem because, again, it was intended to be created this way. And so how do you fix it? And, you know, you fix it the same way you fix anything, with love and compassion. And so you change your policies and you start to try to find any way that you can to keep, especially these children in education. And to me, that's what I'm most proud about, the work that did with Prime Minister Paul Martin and the work that I did with National Chief Sean Atleo. Both men I spent more than 4 years with each, and both of them were huge proponents of First Nations people getting the proper education, culturally based, language, identity, but most importantly, just making sure that they're getting their education and possibly post-secondary education. For Paul Martin, it was all about economics. How do you bridge those gaps between Canadians and Indigenous Canadians? How do you bridge those gaps, and how do you improve the economy as a result? For Sean Atleo, it was all about the children. How do you create a better future for all of these young people that, in lots of ways have been dispossessed of their families, dispossessed of their culture, dispossessed of their language? How do you improve that? And he worked really hard to work with Prime Minister Stephen Harper to achieve that. And again, in the end, it was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that really completed a lot of that work. And I'm really proud to say that too. So again, it's a work in progress, but it's nothing that's going to be fixed overnight, and it might not even be fixed in my lifetime, sadly. But it doesn't mean that we're going to stop trying, and we're going to put in every effort to make sure that we again achieve a better future for them.
Well, let's talk about your community, actually, Jeff. Maybe you could first of all tell us where it is, but also I know that there's been a state of emergency since 2014.
Yeah.
I don't think most Canadians would even think about a state of emergency in place for 12 years. And due to, the loss of life and addictions, and maybe you could just talk about, the really severe challenges that you've faced, and also give us a picture of where you sit in our country of Canada.
Good thing. So Onigaming actually means almost like a portage, like a land crossing. We're sitting between two beautiful bodies of water, Lake of the Woods on one side and Crow Lake on the other. And we're a small community. We've got about 850 total and about 500 on reserve in our community in northwestern Ontario. We're about an hour south of Kenora and an hour north of Fort Frances and Highway 71. And so it's this beautiful, beautiful area, mostly of boreal forest and lakes. If you fly over it, it actually looks like there's more water than land. It's not true, but it looks like that. It is so gorgeous. And we have a long history of cottages, of campers, and of course our own traditional way of life, which we call our treaty rights. And we're based in Treaty Number 3, which was the third treaty, negotiated numbered treaty across the country. And so we've been there. I think we moved there about 120 years ago from another location. And again, I'm really, really proud to be chief. This is my third term, but we're really struggling. And we've been in a state of emergency since 2014. That year, I think there were four or five suicides. That's the year that I almost broke too. I had a young 16-year-old cousin that committed suicide, and it was really devastating for me. And I was already struggling as an alcoholic. I'll get into that a little bit more. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I'm 9 years sober in 2 days, actually. And thank you. And but at that point, I really gave up too. And so our community went into a state of emergency that year. They probably could have declared it earlier because there were a number of deaths in the years preceding. But that said, we've been in a state of emergency ever since. And the truth is that the number of funerals in our community just hasn't stopped. It just hasn't relented. It's been, again, a number of different causes. I think that trauma and grief, from the history of residential schools and day schools is the biggest driving factor. But we're a community that have been going through a lot of suicides for a long time. One of my first memories is of a young cousin, and would have been about 3 years old, and he committed suicide. And I used to play with this young cousin a lot when I was a kid. And the parents tried to hide it from us, but we all knew. We're all kids figure it out. And really, since that day, I feel like we've been riddled with issues of suicide and mental wellness ever since, my whole life. My grandfather committed suicide. So again, there's this real stigma in our community about it. And so we're doing our best to try to heal. Since I've been chief in 4.5 years, we've had about 55 deaths. It feels like we've got a funeral every month. Of those numbers, I think there's been three suicides and two murders. And of those 55 deaths, excuse me, I think that only about 5 or 6 of them have been from old age, natural causes. Most of them have been too young. And, with that said, we do talk to the Ontario and federal government on a regular basis. I want to commend, there's this team of bureaucrats that meets on a monthly basis from Ontario and Canada. We call them trilateral calls. And they really just came as a result of bureaucrats that care about us. They weren't really politically driven or motivated. We just asked if we could have monthly calls. And so the bureaucrats have set it up. They've actually come to our community twice. We've had beautiful ceremonies. We've had beautiful feasts, and really just trying to work together to save lives. And so what we need is infrastructure to start. We just passed a vote in Onigaming to build a $22 million youth center. Both Canada and Ontario are committing almost $10 million towards that. So it's really welcome, and we're paying for the rest of it. That should go to tender for construction this year. We're also applying to Canada for a crisis center, and that just moved past the design phase into the next phase. And so we're hopeful that we will build, I think it's got 6 or 7 crisis safe sober beds in there, crisis beds, and that will help huge. We have community meetings right now where we have young teenagers coming to the meetings, and they're crying because they say that there is abuse at home or there's addiction at home, and they just want somewhere safe to stay. And we don't have anywhere to put them right now. But if we're to get this crisis center, that'll be a start. That'll be a place for them to go. And again, for us to be able to take care of them and keep them safe. Again, for our young people. We really need improved counseling services. Right now, we rely on a tribal council to send in counselors whenever there's crises, but they're just in and out. And what we really need is funding for stable counseling right in the community. Some of that people can talk to on a daily basis, and that doesn't exist right now. Again, to deal with the ongoing grief and trauma. We need committed long-term funding for crisis services and a safety patrol. We're thankful to Canada. We met with Mandy Gilmasti last December, and they've decided to fund those for us, but they're just year to year, and we've been paying for it off and on. But really, we need commitments from governments to help us with long-term funding for safety patrol and crisis teams. On that note, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about what it's been like to be chief. When I first became chief, I got a call, and it was one of our staff, and they said there's this 17-year-old girl who's up on these high rocks, and she's threatening her life. And they said, will you go and talk to her? And I said, why me? Like, why me? And at the time, we didn't have any crisis risk staff or safety patrol. And so I went up there, and it was me and 2 other staff, and we talked to her. And to me, it was really scary. But in the end, we convinced her again, we asked her what her dreams were, and she said she wanted her driver's license. And so we said, we can do that. We can help you. And so we worked to help her get her driver's license. And after that call, I decided then and there that we needed a crisis team. And so we just, through clawing our way through applications, have a crisis team funded. And it's funded through both Ontario and Canada now. And again, that's year to year. I'm worried every year that we're not going to get funded and we're going to end up back in that situation again. But these are the things that we need. And again, this is the reality on the ground right now for our state of emergency.
I don't think most people understand how you get funding too, because it's complicated. And so healthcare, for example, at First Nations is funded federally, not through the province. And so a lot of times my experience has been that, Ontario says, no, we're not doing it. It's you, federal government. And federal government says, no, we don't have funding for that through Indigenous services. And then the community like yours is left saying, we don't really care who's funding it. We just need it done. And, I'm not saying that the healthcare system is perfect in my community of Oakville, but everybody knows where the funding is coming from, right? The province is funding healthcare. They're delivering healthcare. It's jointly funded by both the province and the government of Canada. But in First Nations, it's really challenging. And in Ontario, there isn't like a First Nations health authority that oversees all of it. So right. And that's just for the health side. Then you get into the public safety side. When I was parliamentary secretary at Indigenous Services, one of the things that I tried working on was First Nations policing, and not just police services, but things like safety patrols and crisis, because we know that when the community has those people, they're more effective, yep. Right? And there's tons of data on that, but again, there's no funding for it. So you're scrambling. Do we supply housing for people, or do we provide mental health services? And as a council, you're having to weigh those. Do we put money into clean drinking water, or do we provide mental health services for our kids? And which emergency is the worst right now? I'm sure that was one of the factors that weighed into declaring the state of emergency, was to try and access some funding that wouldn't be available to you otherwise.
That's right. And the reality is that almost everything is application based. And when you're facing, I bet you there's 80 to 100 other First Nations that are remote and in a similar situation as us, in a state of emergency, facing the same number of funerals, the same lack of infrastructure, the same lack of adequate long-term funding. And almost everything that government does is application based. And the reality is that the First Nations that are already doing well, and most of them are in the South and near cities, are the ones that scoop up all those dollars because they're sophisticated. They've got all the consultants. They've got everything ready to go, and good for them. I'm never going to cheer against First Nations from doing well, but those communities that are in states of emergency, again, we've got such little capacity because of the level of addiction issues, because of the level of health issues, because of the level of grief. We've got a counselor on our elected chief on council who's lost 2 brothers in the past couple of years. I lost my sister. Another counselor who's lost her mom, another counselor who's lost 2 nephews, all in the past couple of years. And, how do you get people to show up? How do you get people to, that's why we tell governments and mining companies, for example, that we just can't engage right now, that we're just not able to. The reality is, I hate to say it, but I just can't do everything. and as chief, you're really asked to do everything. It's an enormous job. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm a well-connected, experienced politician, and I still really struggle with the work that we're doing. Until we're able to really focus on the state of emergency and achieve some of the things that we're asking for in terms of infrastructure and services, it's just impossible for us to come to the table. I'll give you an example. There's an aggregate pit in our backyard that's being proposed, and it's right on our old reserve lands, right where we used to live. And the proponent is actually a mayor of a nearby municipality, and for him, it's just more income. And good for him. But when we met, and first of all, we tried to have a consultation session, and we had to reschedule it 4 times because there were 4 funerals. And so every time we booked a community meeting, we had another funeral. When we finally had the meeting and we asked the proponent what was in it for us, he said nothing. Nothing at all. I just want the land and I just want the profits. And he was honest. And so we said we oppose. And so we're hoping that the province of Ontario, again, considers us. But right now, there's no decision. And we worry that they're just going to make a decision to move ahead with development. And so again, when the land all around us is being chewed up for other people's profit and no benefit to us in our own traditional territories, there's no ability for us to make progress, to make these changes. The mining sector isn't that much better. We've got an impact benefit agreement with New Gold Mine, Rainy River Mine in Northwestern Ontario, and it's one of the worst impact benefit agreements I've ever seen. Of course, it was signed about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, but the community was under duress and they didn't have the capacity to negotiate a good impact benefit agreement. So again, for me as chief, until we're able to really save lives, it doesn't make any sense to race into these negotiations. And maybe the last thing that I'll mention, and this is a really important point, I think, for parliamentarians to hear, for regular Canadians to hear, when people talk about free, prior, informed consent, what they're talking about is that, or when people are talking about treaty rights, they're talking about individual First Nation people. They're talking about individual First Nation citizens that have rights. And so the goal is that if you're meeting with a community to mine, to do forestry, whatever the business is, that you're supposed to be engaging and having consultation with all of these individuals that are treaty rights holders, not just chief and council. So I don't think it's even fair to be, again, asking chief and council to sign these agreements without full consultation of their peoples. And that's what the goal is. That's what the legislation is that the Trudeau government passed, that the British Columbia government passed. I think there's other jurisdictions looking at it as well. But for us, until our population is healthy enough to be engaged in full, it's almost impossible. And that's just the reality of industry on the ground right now.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish too the difference between rights holders and stakeholders.
Right.
And I think too often companies and governments go in and say that they've consulted with all the stakeholders, whereas and you talked about treaty rights, that First Nations people are rights holders; they're not stakeholders, and it's a very important distinction to make when and often too, Jeff, these consultations are not true consultations. Decisions have been made, and a company will show up and say, "Okay, well, this is what we're doing, and we're here to get your consent," as opposed to, "We'd like to work with you to try and do whatever it is. How can we work together? And you have certain rights in this process that we have to respect." So it's a very important distinction that I don't think it's talked about nearly enough.
Thank you. There's again, not enough education, not enough awareness. Again, as you're saying, we're talking about constitutional rights holders, and that's what treaty rights are. And when people talk about treaty rights, I know that people don't always understand. But for us, it was all about sharing the land. It was all about sharing decision making. That's what treaty rights are. um, living together in harmony. You know, there's a story actually from when Treaty 3 was negotiated, and it was by, I think, a chief, Sakatchewe is how they pronounce his name. And he was one of our Treaty 3 chiefs that negotiated treaty. And he met with the representatives from the Crown. And what he said was, you will give me your child, firstborn, and they will come live with us. And I will give you my firstborn, son or daughter, and they will live with you. And they will live amongst each other, and they will learn what's good about each other, and they'll teach us. And that's what treaty was. Again, trying to create a shared understanding of life, shared understanding of how to share, of how to do things together. And that's not what's happening on the ground today. It's just realistically not. Last March, I got a letter, or sorry, I got an email from an exploration company called Golden Rapture. And their CEO, who I'd never met, just sent me an agreement to sign. And in the email, he says, just sign here. It's good for your community. And so I sent him back an email and I said, no, we're not going to sign and we're not interested. We're in a state of emergency. And I just told him the truth about our reality. And I got an email back that said that I'm a bad chief. And he blamed the deaths on me. And he said that I should resign. And so you get a lot of bullying from industry. And so I went public with that. I was really grateful. National Chief Cindy Woodhouse really advocated for us and went to the media. But again, that's just the reality of industry. It's very pushy, it's very aggressive, and not a lot of respect for First Nation treaty rights. And so that's where the struggle really begins on the ground.
You have had your own journey with sobriety, and you know, I'm really proud every time you talk about how long it's been, and I know you take a lot of pride in your sobriety right now. It's not an easy path to walk, but you are setting a really good example for people in your community that it is possible and that it's not always a straight line. Can you maybe talk about that journey that you've been on, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm happy to. You know, I grew up with a lot of alcoholism in my family. My dad struggles with alcohol. My sister did before she passed. Both of my grandparents, my grandfathers. And again, to me, it all really comes from residential schools again. So much shame, and shame is really a big part of addiction. You know, I lived in that shame. In 2007, I had a young niece go missing, and she's never been found. She was 16 at the time, and that same year, I had a good friend commit suicide. And I think from that year until about 2017, when I got sober, I drank every single day and night, from 2007 to 2017. So 10 years of drinking straight. It got so bad that I lost all my jobs. I lost my apartments. I ended up, you know, I was so low that I was drinking in the streets in Ottawa in 2016. And thankfully, I had some friends believe in me. You know, maybe I'll just mention a couple of names, Patrick Dion and Jamie Carroll, both men that I met in the Liberal Party of Canada, and they helped save my life. Um, you know, they both helped me get into treatment. They both let me stay with them when I was homeless. They both pushed hard for me. And it took me 4 times in treatment. But I got sober in March 2017 and I've been sober ever since. And, you know, sometimes as chief, you know, you feel helpless that you can't really do a lot. But the thing that I take the most pride in is living by example and trying to live a good life. You know, when I moved home, again, there was all kinds of addiction issues. There still are, but there's a bit of a sober movement going on. And so you're seeing young people now following suit. I'm really public about my sobriety. I post it all over social media. And now you're starting to see some young people put up their sobriety numbers on social media as well. That's the best feeling. Um, there were a lot of people as well during my first campaign that questioned if I could stay sober being chief, and I'm proud to say I'm still a sober chief. um, but I feel great. I'll just say this to people. When my sister passed last year, um, I was really worried about my sobriety, so I went back to treatment a fourth time just to be preemptive about it. And I just want to tell people that there's no shame. Um, I've also helped parliamentarians. That's the funny thing. I kind of keep some of these secrets, but ever since I've got sober and been public about it, I've been able to help a lot of people. And so I just urge people to, if you need help, just ask, especially young people, but especially young First Nations people. I'm really, really hoping for a future where we see, these First Nation communities where they don't remember these days, where they don't remember the state of emergency, that they just know what's healthy, they know what good education is, they know what good jobs are, and that they're having healthy families themselves, and that this is all part of the past. That's my dream.
Well, one of the biggest things is hopelessness. And
Yeah.
what you actually are getting to these kids, Jeff, is you're showing them that there is hope and that they do have something to hope for. When they look at you, they can see, and I don't think there's anything more important than someone who's walked that journey to be able to talk to them, to say, I actually know what you're going through. I've been through it myself. I know how hard it is. And, that example that you're giving to people, and sometimes you may not even know that you're helping someone, but just by being open about what you've been through and what you're doing, could be saving a life, Jeff. So thank you for doing that.
I get stopped at the local gym in Astor Falls, and it's all of our young people there. And they stop me and they say, "Good job, man." And I'm like, they all give me high fives, and so it feels good. And it does. It feels like I'm really giving back, and again making up for those lost years of my own.
I read a book. I don't know if you've read it. It's called The Ballad of Danny, and it's about the young man who founded the first Indigenous gang in Winnipeg. He and his brother. It's a really good book, but he was 10 and his brother was 8 years old, and they were drinking, using drugs, stealing cars. Their mom had been in resident. You could draw a straight line from their forming the gang and their addictions to residential schools, because their mom had been in residential schools, and so when they formed that gang, it wasn't because they wanted to get rich or, what people think of with gangs. They just wanted a sense of community and a family.
Yeah.
And they had no role models to look up to or show them the path. And so this was the path they chose, of stealing cars and selling drugs when they were, you think 8 and 10 years old. Those kids are so young. Their life shouldn't be like that, but sadly, that's the reality of too many First Nations and Indigenous kids in this country.
Yeah, I just want to give a quick shout out because I don't do it enough. But I had two amazing role models when I was a child, and they were my mom and my dad. And even though my dad struggled with alcohol, he worked for 26 years at the Kenora Mill, and he raised us. And he taught me about hard work ethic, and he was really kind to everyone. Um, you know, After years later, I think he was actually pretty scared. I think he really struggled with racism. But he was just kind to everybody. And so I learned that from him. And my mom, on the other hand, I watched her. She was a high school dropout, and by the time I was 8 years old, she had gotten her high school equivalency as well as her college degree. I still remember watching her graduate. She just got her master's at 60, and she was a real fighter. So when we faced racism as a kid, she would go and fight them. And she taught us how to stand up for ourselves. And so I was really lucky to have two heroes and role models as a young man, despite how tough our lives were. Again, that's really the reason I am the way I am today. So shout out to mom and dad.
Yeah. Listen, one last question for you.
Yeah.
What dream do you have to do one day?
Thank you for asking. You know, another experience I had when I was 16 was my high school sent me to Ottawa to debate in something called Ontario Youth Parliament. And during one of those debates, we actually got to go into Parliament Hill. And it was my first time. I was just a little kid or young teenager. And I didn't know much about politics. And the only name that I recognized was Preston Manning. And so I pretended to be Preston Manning. I don't think I do that today, but I pretended to be him when I was 16. And I remember thinking how amazing it would be to be a member of parliament someday. And so the truth is that my dream since I was 16 years old has been to be a member of parliament. I was at the Liberal Christmas party last December. I told the Prime Minister that I'm interested in running for the Liberal Party someday. We had a good handshake and smile, and it's still my dream. I think this is probably my last term as chief. It's my third term. And I really think that I'd love to be the voice for Northern Ontario someday. I'd love to be the voice for the people of the Kenora riding. And it's something that I've thought about, my whole life. And so if it happens soon, I'd be excited about that. If something that doesn't happen right away, then so be it. But my dream is to be a member of parliament. And I hope to chase that someday.
Well, I think you'd be great, Jeff. So I'll come up and knock on doors for you. That's for sure.
Awesome.
Kevin, I'm going to turn it back over to you just to close this up. But just before I do, I just want to say, Jeff, I could keep talking to you for hours. This has just been such a lovely conversation. We've only hit the tip of the iceberg on a lot of these subjects, but thank you so much for being available. Kevin?
Yeah, I completely agree, Pam. That was a wonderful discussion. Thanks, Jeff, or should I say Mish Quayab? Is that your
right on?
Good. Oh, that's a wonderful name. That was a wonderful discussion, and thanks so much for sharing, your personal journey and the journey of your community and ideas on how we can work together to truly make things better. I agree with Pam. I could listen to that for hours. I think we should definitely have more discussions with you. Perhaps we'll bring you in as a host, and you can bring in other voices that need to have a platform and people need to hear from. So, thank you both for that wonderful discussion, and really appreciate it. Maybe I'll just say thanks again to our sustaining sponsors: MAPCO, CBTU, NWMO, TikTok, Bruce Power, Sandstone Group, Faskin, and National Newswatch. And I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in and listened to our discussion today, and just say thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Miigwech.
Miigwech, exactly. Thanks, everyone.